Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Animal Legal Defense Fund's webinar. My name is Megan, and I'm one of our events associates. Today, we will be discussing exposing wildlife services using the Freedom of Information Act. We will have a brief Q&A at the end of the presentation. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Additional resources for this webinar are available on our website at aldf.org/webinars. This webinar offers closed captioning. Closed captioning is automatically turned off. To turn on, please click the caret icon near the CC button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. To change the font size, click on Subtitle Settings. We recommend keeping your mouse cursor off the Zoom monitor to prevent the captioning from moving up on the screen. Joining us today are Campaigns Manager Matt Rossell and Campaigner Abbey Benesh. As Campaigns Manager, Matt inspires and engages our supporters to participate in Animal Legal Defense Fund's work and increase our success throughout the organization. Abbey is responsible for increasing supporter engagement through outreach, relationship development and management, and drafting campaign-related content. Thank you both for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. I'll pass it over to you, and we will see everyone back here for live Q&A at the end of the presentation.
Hi, everyone. I am very excited to be here today. I want to thank everyone for showing up. I want to thank you for your ongoing support to the Animal Legal Defense Fund. And I'm really excited to co-present this webinar. First, let's talk a little bit about what you can expect. In the first half of the webinar, expect to learn about wildlife services. This is a federal program within the United States Department of Agriculture responsible for killing millions of animals every year, including native wildlife like coyotes, wolves, and bears, under the mission of resolving human and animal conflict. You will learn the history of this rogue agency, how they sometimes operate outside of the law, and what the Animal Legal Defense Fund is doing to expose the killing and push for non-lethal policies. In the second part of the webinar, Abbey is going to tell you about the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, and explain how we use this federal FOIA law and similar state laws to request records about wildlife services activity and how we use those documents to protect animals. So first, what is wildlife services? And thank you, Abbey. Wildlife services is a program under the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, known as APHIS, and their stated mission is to resolve problems that occur when human activity and wildlife conflict with one another. But in reality, wildlife services is an agricultural industry killing machine, particularly in the Western US, where it, quote, protects domestic farmed animals and ranchers from so-called predators, coyotes, wolves, and other animals. To accomplish this, wildlife services kills millions of animals every year, but most Americans are unaware the program even exists, let alone that our taxes are funding it. The program cost in 2021 was $188 million. Roughly half of that, or every year, roughly around $100 million of our taxes are used to fund this program. The program is also funded through private interests. So let's talk next about the history of this agency. Over the decades, the program has killed countless millions of animals using inhumane and outdated methods, disrupting ecosystems, and sometimes violating laws. Previously, the Wildlife Services Program was known as Animal Damage Control, and it's gone by other names over the years. But congressional funding for such activity dates back more than 100 years to 1885. The program originated from ranchers and farmers asking for and receiving financial help from the federal government to kill rodents, birds, predators, and other wildlife that were a threat to their business interests. So where does the authority for all this killing come from? Wildlife Services congressional broad authority comes from a couple of federal laws. The Animal Damage Control Act, and that gives the government authority to, quote, conduct a program of wildlife services with respect to injurious animal species, and take any action the Secretary considers necessary in conducting the program. And the Rural Development Act, which allows wildlife services to, quote, enter into agreements with states, local jurisdictions, individuals, and public and private organizations and institutions for the control of nuisance mammals and birds. But Wildlife Services Authority is also limited by other laws, including the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. These are some of the laws that the Animal Legal Defense Fund has been able to successfully use to bring about positive changes that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. So let's talk a bit about the culture of the organization. The program has historically prioritized and is in part funded by these special interests, ranchers and farmers. So it could easily be considered a conflict of interest in the program's broad directive to consider a range of public interests that include wildlife conservation, biological diversity, and the welfare of animals, in addition to managing for human recreation and financial interests. But we learn a lot from whistleblowers. These are former Wildlife Service employees that have revealed a program-wide corruption that depicts a culture that favors catering to these private interests. So let's look a little bit more behind the scenes at Wildlife Services. The facts I'm about to share come from a documentary that was produced by an organization called Predator Defense. And this documentary is titled Exposed, USDA's Secret War on Wildlife. This is available on YouTube, and I really encourage you, if you're interested to learn more, to check this documentary out. But in the documentary, they interview a few former Wildlife Service employees, and the first of which, former Wildlife Service trapper Rex Shattuck, exposed that they were using banned pesticides, thallium sulfite, compound 1080, sodium strychnine, DDT. But in fact, these pesticides were being provided to Wildlife Services by the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. Now, you need to understand that in the case of Wyoming and in most states, the Department of Agriculture is tasked with oversight for the Wildlife Services activity in the state. But in this case, instead of overseeing the policies and laws, they were selling old stockpiles of illegal pesticides banned in 1972, which should have been destroyed, to sell to ranchers and predator boards across the state to kill predators. Employees were also instructed by supervisors to hide evidence of non-target kills, cows, eagles, and other animals. They referred to this as the 3 S's, to shoot, shut up, and shovel. That is, to bury and not report when they had accidental kills. This was described by one supervisor as, quote, job security, and that they needed to make the ranchers happy. Record keeping was doctored accordingly. Employees were instructed also not to put up legal signs that were required to warn the public of these dangerous pesticides. A supervisor said they did not want people to tamper with, photograph, or get upset about the poison units. And when dogs were accidentally killed with poisons, the Wildlife Service trappers were told to remove the collars, bury the dogs, and not report. And this particular instance, the directions came from state supervisors through the district supervisor, through our troubleshooters, and then to us, was a direct quote from this whistleblower. He went on to say that most supervisors I know have a total disregard for the policy. A lot of this was reinforced by another former Wildlife Service trapper, Gary Strader, who was also told to bury and not report a golden eagle by his supervisor. He was called a troublemaker and soon got fired for reporting his coworkers illegally shooting 2 cougars from an airplane. He also described how, despite whatever policies state about checking traps, there was really no policy in practice, and traps could go unchecked for weeks or longer, which means animals are dying of exposure, starvation, dehydration, and predation from other animals. And at this point, I think it's worth highlighting just how important whistleblowers are in helping organizations like ours identify, investigate, document, and expose cruelty to animals. We take very seriously our important work in protecting whistleblowers from retaliation and fight back against attempts to limit free speech, as is the case with all of our successful ag-gag lawsuits. As you might know, if you follow our work, ag-gag laws seek to gag would-be whistleblowers and undercover activists by punishing them for recording footage of what goes on in animal agriculture. And we have had an enormous amount of success pushing back against these unconstitutional laws that have been put forth in various states. And you can find out more about that on our website. But not all the behind-the-scenes details of abuse of wildlife services comes from whistleblowers. Some of it gets posted on social media. This was the case in another incident when a wildlife service trapper used his own dogs to kill coyotes caught in traps. This was discovered when he posted pictures on Facebook. It says a lot that he felt so comfortable doing this that he would post these pictures publicly. And this is one of the many pictures that he posted until it became public and he was criticized for it. And then he did take the pictures down. And despite the fact that there was a policy change about using dogs, personal dogs on the trap line for these wildlife service trappers, another whistleblower confirmed that this type of activity was common. So what animals are involved and how many? Well, our most recent records come from 2021, last year, where wildlife services killed more than 1.75 million animals, including hundreds of thousands of native species: wolves, coyotes, foxes, prairie dogs, mountain lions, bobcats, bears, beavers, and birds. Overall, last year, wildlife services killed 485 different species of animals in various numbers. So let's talk a little bit about the most killed species. You can see this chart shows some of the most killed species. You can see it includes both non-native species, which are marked in the orange columns, and native species, which are the green columns. And just to distinguish, non-native species means that the species didn't historically live in North America. And some of those, the one at the top of the list is the European starling. This is the most killed animal by wildlife services by far. More than 1 million European starlings are killed. And feral swine is next on the list. These are pigs that were either introduced for hunting or escaped and became feral. And nearly 150,000 of these are killed or were killed last year. But it also includes native species. You can see coyotes, Canada geese, beavers, and many other native species on down the list are also killed in the top killed animals by wildlife services. And I want to just talk a bit about some alternatives here, just using the European starling as an example. One major point of conflict where these birds are poisoned is at dairy CAFOs. These are these massive factory farmed dairy farms. And they're being poisoned for eating feed intended for cows. But one study showed that this behavior can be reduced by more than 79% just by adjusting the size of the food pellets to make it more difficult for the birds to eat it. So it just goes to show you that there are, just one of many examples of the ways that we could avoid killing all these animals. Next, we're going to talk about the indiscriminate methods that wildlife services uses. Wildlife services gun down coyotes and wolves from helicopters and airplanes, Trappers employed by the agency use poison baits, neck snares, body gripping traps, leg hold traps, and cyanide traps, which are known as M44s. All of these are indiscriminate. Obviously, they can try to target for specific animals, but that isn't always the case. And sometimes other animals get trapped. And let's do a little bit more of a deeper dive into what these M44s are. Here's a closer look at these spring-activated M44 cyanide capsules. You can see from this diagram how these controversial and dangerous devices work. A small nozzle wrapped in cloth is exposed above the ground and baited with a sweet scent, attracting a bite and pull response from animals such as coyotes. But any animal that pulls on this device triggers it to spray. The poison causes internal bleeding, seizures, or lung failure before the animal dies. An extremely cruel death. Many non-target animals, including pets, become unintended victims due to these indiscriminate methods. And you can go to the next slide, please. Like in this case in 2017, an M44 cyanide trap went off in the face of Canyon Mansfield, a 14-year-old Idaho boy who was walking his dog on their property. Their dog, Casey, died as a result. An investigation by the Sacramento Bee exposed that between 2000 and 2012, more than 1,100 dogs were killed by these devices. And just a little bit of silver lining to this very sad story, this family, the Mansfield family, was so upset and moved by what happened to their family, to their child, to their dog. And once they investigated on their own what was behind Wildlife Services, they turned that energy into a positive thing, and they started advocating for the eradication of these M44s. And we'll talk a little bit later in the program about some of the success that they've had being spokespersons for an end to these deadly devices. So next, it's time for a little break in our program. It's time for a poll. And here's your poll question. Everyone gets to participate. How many accidental or unintentional deaths do you think were reported by Wildlife Services in 2021? Go ahead, and only one answer is correct. Go ahead and take the poll now, and we'll give you a little bit of time to record your answers. Okay, and I'm not seeing the results on my end. Are we getting, oh, here we go. Okay, I'll give a few more seconds, but it looks like we have our results. And the first choice, most people chose 1,100. This was a little bit of a trick question because I did choose some numbers that had already been presented, but we can go ahead and close out the poll. I'm going to move on and give you the answer. And the answer was nearly 3,000. We're going to look here at the causes of unintentional deaths in 2021. Trap snares and poisons set by Wildlife Services led to the death of almost 3,000 unintended animals. Just to go back, the 1,100, I did trip you up a little bit. That was from the Sacramento Bee. They reported that many dogs were killed within about a 12-year window. That was specifically only looking at dogs, but this is talking about 3,000 unintended animals in the year of 2021. And of those, as you can see in this chart, body gripping traps caused over a third of those deaths, then foothold traps, neck snares, and M44s, and on down the list. Let's talk about some of the top species unintentionally killed in 2021. You can see here that nearly 600 river otters were killed almost 500 raccoons, over 350 foxes, and on down the list. Topping the list include snapping turtles, muskrats, coyotes, skunks, peccaries, porcupines, and opossums. These statistics come directly from Wildlife Services. Every year they generate a report about the number and details of animals the program kills. As we have learned from whistleblowers, we have to be cautious about the possible underreporting of these numbers. But let's take a closer look at what the records show for 2021 on some specific species. First, coyotes. They tend to eat smaller animals, not farmed animals. Nonetheless, over 64,000 coyotes were killed by Wildlife Services in 2021. More so, an estimated 400,000 total are killed overall in the US every year. Now, this is an estimate, and this comes from all hunting combined, private hunters and government agencies, everything combined. Sadly, coyotes must be among the most maligned and wrongfully hated wild animals in the country. Most states have open season all year with no limits on how many you can kill. Organized killing contests are common, and the Animal Legal Defense Fund right now is opposing killing contests in Oregon and Virginia. So we really encourage all our supporters to support these efforts in every state where you reside if you have these killing contests to try to get them banned and outlawed. However, all the killing over the past 100+ years has not curbed this species population. Why? Why is that? Well, coyotes are uniquely adaptable. When their populations are diminished, it creates an increase in their food sources. They adapt by having larger litters. This is referred to in the literature as the bounce back effect, and it happens with other species as well. But despite this extensive evidence from studies approving that these lethal control methods do not work, the killing continues. Next, we're going to talk about bears and wolves. You can see here in 2021, there were 433 black bears killed, 324 wolves, and 6 grizzly bears. And it's worth pointing out, grizzly bears are actually protected as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, which means that by law, they cannot be harassed or killed except for cases of self-defense or protection of others. Next, we're going to talk about beavers. You can see nearly 25,000 beavers were targeted. Why? Beavers cut down trees and build dams. And that is just in their nature. They've evolved over the millennia to do these things. It's a role they play in their prospective habitats. But when they build dams, it does cause flooding. So how can we mitigate this negative effect? Well, there are alternatives to killing them. You can simply protect the base of trees with chicken wire. There are also flow-through devices that can prevent flooding issues. And in California, conservationists have had to threaten lawsuits, pointing out that killing beavers and their habitat and the habitat they create violates provisions of the Endangered Species Act because beaver activity is critical to the survival of endangered salmon and other species. Next up, we're going to talk about deer and bobcats. You can see that over 9,000 white-tailed deer were killed last year, 54 sandhill cranes, and 605 bobcats. What about cormorants? This water bird that is native was killed by Wildlife Services in numbers exceeding 9,000, 9,642 according to their records. Why? These birds are guilty of eating fish, salmon and steelhead. Now, these fish are endangered fish species, but they are threatened by human-caused problems, overfishing and habitat destruction as a result of dams, not predation by another native species. Next up, we're going to talk about cats and dogs. In fact, there's documented 551 community cats were killed last year. Now, these are otherwise known as feral cats. Even though the evidence shows that killing feral cats does not solve the problem, trap, neuter, release programs are much more effective in curbing feral cat populations. And also 145 dogs were killed. 2 of them were in the process of protecting domestic farmed animals. Next up, we have prairie dogs. You can see that almost 9,000 prairie dogs were killed, and close to 19,000 of their dens were destroyed. Besides being extremely cute, prairie dogs are a keystone prairie species. And what this means is that many other species depend on them in some way. One of them is one of North America's most endangered species, the black-footed ferret. Black-footed ferrets depend entirely on the presence of prairie dogs for their food, shelter, and raising young. Prairie dog populations back in the 1800s was estimated at 5 billion individuals. Now they occupy only 5% of their historic range, with 2 of the 5 species threatened or endangered. They are killed because ranchers think they compete with cows for grass. And there is a long-held myth that cows break their legs in prairie dog dens. While it's true, prairie dogs clear all the grass from their colonies, and they have to be able to see their predators coming, so they keep their grass mowed. But studies have shown that cows and bison prefer new growth of the grasses and tend to prefer to graze in these prairie dog colonies because they love the flavor of the young sprouting grasses, and it's actually more nutritious for them. And there's no evidence to back up these myths that cows are breaking their legs in prairie dog holes. So next, we're going to talk about cougars, eagles, and red-tailed hawks. You can see here 200 cougars or mountain lions were killed last year, over 2,000 red-tailed hawks, and 1 bald eagle, our nation's bird. So with all this reckless and needless killing, where is the public accountability for this agency? Well, this program has long come under fire from conservation-minded individuals, organizations like ours and many others, and lawmakers for using lethal methods when humane alternatives exist, and for a lack of transparency and accountability to the public, and for the inhumane methods that are giving dubious results. We're going to keep working on this issue. We encourage you to support our efforts to keep working on this issue. And we won't stop until we can curb the killing, at least make sure that every available option is taken before any lethal methods are used. And let's talk a little bit about the humane alternatives. Do these non-lethal alternatives to lethal methods work? Well, the best available science suggests that humane, non-lethal methods of wildlife conflict management should and are the best ways to prevent conflict before it even occurs. In most cases, killing predators is not a sound wildlife control method. For example, killing an adult mountain lion tends to lead to more attacks on domestic animals because that established male kept out the more aggressive teenagers. This is referred to as the vacuum effect, where when you take out an animal, neighboring animals of the same species move in to the territory. Again, this happens with other species as well, and is a large part of why lethal control isn't working. It's critically important that the government educate the public about humane options to reduce the killing of domestic animals by predators. Some humane options include fladry. This is pictured in this slide here. Fladry is just a series of flags on a fence line. And these little red flags will flutter in the breeze. And for whatever reason, when wolves or other predators approach this, it sets them off. They are a little bit unsure about what to do, and they typically will not cross this fence line. There's many other options. Just other predator-proof fencing can be used. Light and sound generating devices can be effective. Shed lambing, which is simply lambing, or when sheep are giving birth to make sure that they're indoors. That's when they're most vulnerable, obviously. And night penning, putting animals up at night. Addition to these methods, the public should be reminded that young animals are exceptionally vulnerable and should be looked after. It's just common sense. Before I conclude my portion of the talk, I want to share a bit of good news. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. You can see from this graph, a number of animals killed by wildlife services is on the decline. From a high in 2008 and 2010 of more than 5 million animals killed, the numbers have been dropping to a low in 2020 of about 1.5 million. We really hope to see this trend continue, and this is some good news. And then another bit of good news, and you can go ahead and turn to the next slide. Oregon, in the legal front, Oregon passed a statewide ban on M44s in 2019, and Idaho did the same in 2020. M44s are still being used in 13 states. In Colorado and Wyoming, however, they're only allowed on private land, so they've been banned on public property. They are still allowed statewide in Nevada, Utah, Montana, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Virginia, and West Virginia. But there is hope on the horizon. Congress is looking at a federal law, Canyons Law, and it's been introduced in the House of Representatives by Peter DeFazio and in the Senate by Senator Jeff Markley. This law is a law we should all look to supporting. Everyone needs to contact their representatives in Congress and urge them to support Canyons Law. It will, when passed, eliminate one of the most dangerous poisons that are being used by wildlife services. And that concludes my portion of the webinar. I really thank you for your attention. And next up is Abbey to talk about the freedom of information.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Abbey Benesh, and as Megan mentioned, I'm a campaigner here at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I'll be talking a bit about what the Freedom of Information Act is and how our organization uses it as a tool. So first things first, what is FOIA? FOIA stands for the Freedom of Information Act. It provides the public the right to request access to federal records from any federal agency. Agencies are required to disclose any information requested under FOIA unless it falls within one of 9 exemptions. These protect things like personal privacy, national security, and law enforcement, etc. So today, most FOIA requests can be made online like most things, as we'll talk about here shortly. This typically involves a Google search with the term FOIA request and the name of the agency you're interested in receiving those documents from. FOIA allows agencies 20 working days to provide a determination on a request for records unless there are unusual circumstances. If a government agency fails to comply with a FOIA request in a timely manner, a lawsuit can be filed to hold the agency responsible and also to receive those requested documents. Each state also has a similar sunshine law that can be utilized by the public. For example, I'm in Utah and our sunshine law is called a GRAMA request, or the Government Records Access and Management Act. And there's a separate process for this GRAMA request than there is for the federal FOIA request. So our organization has a history of challenging wildlife services cruel killing policies. One example of this is our victory against the USDA for redactions made in a public record request pertaining to the number of geese the city of Denver was prepared to kill. A little background on that case. So in 2019, residents of Denver expressed their concerns about the geese population in their city parks, aka they're worried about the amount of poop on their sidewalks that they were using. Denver then engaged wildlife services to initiate a mass culling and slaughter of the geese. After learning about this, our organization stepped in and used the Freedom of Information Act to seek information pertaining to the number of geese that Denver was planning to kill. So here's our copy of the request. As you can see, it's not overly broad and it's not too narrow. We're specifically requesting contracts between APHIS and RNC Wild Game and Custom Processing, the slaughterhouse, and contracts between APHIS and an individual named Rossell Lee Spence. The USDA's response to that request included the contract with the slaughterhouse, but the number of birds expected to be killed, as well as the price paid per slaughter bird, were both redacted. So we filed an appeal in March 2020 seeking that redacted information, but the USDA did not respond in that reasonable amount of time, so this prompted a lawsuit. The lawsuit itself alleged that the USDA was trying to hide the true scale of the planned slaughter. Specifically, the redactions claimed exemption B4. However, this protects trade secrets and commercial or financial information that is obtained from outside the government and that is privileged or confidential. It wasn't clear to us why this redacted information would fall into this category of exemptions. And because these redactions did seem invalid, we were able to challenge the USDA to gain access to this hidden information. And here are some of the headlines that resulted. The agency fought for nearly 2 years to censor information concerning the number of geese it planned to kill. The unredacted records revealed that Wildlife Services prepared to slaughter as many as 2,700 geese in 2019, despite the fact that the public was already upset about the fact they killed 1,600 geese already up to this point. The agency's attempt to keep the public in the dark about its true intent resulted in taxpayers unknowingly funding an additional $15,000 in tax-paid attorney fees on top of the cost of slaughtering the geese in the first place. After receiving the redacted information, headlines like these resulted. Our fight for transparency resulted in the distribution of important information to taxpayers regarding the operation of their government and the way their money was being spent. Another less than glamorous headline that resulted from this case was the fact that Denver was donating the geese meat to kitchens that feed underserved communities. All these findings were made available to the public, and the affected communities were then able to use this information to ask for change. The Animal Legal Defense Fund is also making progress through precedent-setting litigation. For example, in Monterey County, California, Wildlife Services had killed more than 3,000 coyotes, bobcats, mountain lions, and other animals in the course of 6 years before this lawsuit. The contracts for this programming were, of course, public records that were obtainable via public record requests from the county or the USDA. Our organization and other groups sued the county for contracting with Wildlife Services without first complying with the California Environmental Quality Act. That is California's premier environmental protection act. Basically, the act requires that there be an environmental impact report before taking action that may affect the environment. In this case, no impact report was completed prior to the contracting. Ultimately, the court agreed with us and ordered Monterey County to review their predator call program in accordance with California state law. Again, here are some headlines that resulted. Basically, this victory set precedent moving forward that we were able to leverage other California counties with to also terminate or not contract with Wildlife Services. And here are a few examples of victories that resulted from the precedent-setting case in Monterey County. They came about in Humboldt, Mendocino, and I might say this wrong, Siskiyou County. And these are the headlines here. The Animal Legal Defense Fund has also challenged Wildlife Services through the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NEPA requires Wildlife Services to rigorously examine the environmental effects of killing wildlife and to also consider alternatives that rely on proven non-lethal methods to avoid these wildlife conflicts. If the agency is not adequately considering these non-lethal alternatives, we are able to take legal action. And to help provide some context to this process, I myself just filled out a FOIA request, and I can walk you through what this looked like. Basically, I was interested in learning about active contracts and reporting between Wildlife Services and Salt Lake County, where I live. I filled out the form and requested documents for all active contracts between Salt Lake County and Wildlife Services, as well as any reporting to Salt Lake County by Wildlife Services for any active contracts for the year of 2022. I submitted my request and received an email with a copy of that request form on November 7th. On the 8th, the next day, I received a formal acknowledgement letter. And on the 17th, I received the documents that I requested from the USDA. This included a response letter as well as the record documents. The record outlined the objective of Wildlife Services, as you see here, And basically that is to provide a simple, low cost, low maintenance system of handling nuisance and damage related issues associated with specifically raccoons and skunks in the county. And any resident who resides in the participating jurisdictions that has problems with a skunk or raccoon can purchase a live cage or trap at your own expense and trap the animal or animals, and then basically call on wildlife services to come pick up, remove, dispose of the animal in accordance with state law and AVMA guidelines. So basically what this is saying is that any Salt Lake resident that doesn't want skunks or raccoons in their yard can obtain a trap, trap them, and call on wildlife services to dispose of them, no questions asked. Further down on the report, there's a really vague breakdown of their budget, which totals just under $100,000, but it also notes that distribution of the budget may vary as necessary. What this report did not include is the number and type of animals killed. In order to gain this information, I submitted another FOIA request asking for these specifics. Even from the information I was able to receive, I found a few things troubling, namely that Wildlife Services is leaving it up to residents to decide whether or not they'd like to trap and request that Wildlife Services remove these animals based on their own personal morals and ethics. What we'd really like to see here is the county offering some leadership and taking a position on exhausting non-lethal humane options first. So despite some of these less than ideal responses, at least I now have a better idea of how Wildlife Services is functioning in my community, and I have the ability to take some proactive steps towards protecting animals and encouraging this agency to opt for more humane options. Time for another poll. So after hearing our presentation, how likely are you to get involved with the Animal Legal Defense Fund's efforts to protect wildlife? We have a few options here. Yes, definitely, most likely, somewhat likely, not at all. Be honest, we won't be upset with you. And I'll give you guys a little bit of time to answer here and we'll go over it. All right. Get those answers in. Oh, terrific. Looks like most people are in the likely, most likely, yes, definitely category. We love to see that. And if you're interested in getting involved, you can visit aldf.org/take-action. And at this site, you're able to view our national and state actions, as well as to sign up for our action alerts. That completes our presentation. Thank you everyone so much for your time and participation. I do think we have a little bit of time left for some questions if there are any, and really just thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Matt and Abby. That was very informative. We do have some questions coming in, and for anybody else who has questions, you can go ahead and submit them using that Q&A icon, and we will do the best to get through as many as we can. Your first question: is the Wildlife Services program we just learned about the same as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
That's a really good question because that can be confusing. So no, they are different. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is under the Department of Interior, and they are tasked with, in the broader sense, of managing fish, wildlife, and habitats in general. Whereas Wildlife Services that we are speaking about is a program under the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. So it, and specifically, they're tasked with the conflict between wildlife and people. So different agencies with different missions. So thank you for asking that.
Excellent. Next question is: to what do you attribute the decline in Wildlife Services killing over the past decade or more?
Well, it's hard to know for sure, but we really hope that, you know, based on the evidence and the science being so supportive of the fact that these lethal killing methods are not successfully working to mitigate the conflict, we really hope that this is the agency doing a better job of educating the public, and really thanks to all the public scrutiny that has happened with various organizations shining light on this, as well as lawmakers, we really hope that the decline will continue. So thanks for that question.
Next up, do the most killed numbers mean those which the agencies reported, given the evidence of the shoot, shut up, shovel, and bearing pet dogs?
Yeah, that's a really good point. How can we know that these numbers are accurate when we know that there's been a history here of, hiding the truth and not documenting all of the kills? So I guess we can at least say that this is a low number, and it's hard to say the numbers could be much higher, obviously.
Next up, will the Canyons Law be reintroduced in the next congressional session starting in January?
That's a really good question. Yeah, our this congressional session is about to end, and we have every reason to expect that the Canyons Law will be reintroduced. And it is a law that our organization has supported, and we're going to continue to support that until it passes. Thanks for your question.
Yeah. And it looks like we have time for about one more.
Okay.
And this one's, okay, so although I disfavor trial by media, especially trial by social media, educated and informed public awareness has great value in correcting situations and changing law and policy. What does ALDF do in that venue?
Well, that's kind of right up Abbey and my alley. We're campaigners, but we're within the communications department, and we really rely on the media, and even more so lately, social media, to get the word out about the suffering of animals in our work. And it really is a matter of education. I'll give one example. One of our campaigns to oppose puppy mills, and specifically opposing the online sale of puppy mill puppies on Craigslist. You would imagine, and I'm sure most everyone who's listening to this webinar is well aware of the cruelty of puppy mills, and yet a lot of people just don't know. And so what we have been able to successfully do is expose the killing, the sales of puppy mill puppies on some of these online sources using social media, and gathering victims, the human victims, who have either been scammed by fake puppy sales, or they've bought puppy mill puppies unknowingly on Craigslist and other places, and then had those animals suffer from medical issues or even die. So we've been able to use these outlets to let people know that we're working on this issue. We've collected many stories from these individuals who have suffered, and we have an ongoing campaign that we have, we're going to keep working on this until we can ban the online sales of puppies. So, virtually every one of our campaigns is enhanced by the use of getting the message out through social media and the mainstream media. So thanks so much for your questions. And I guess that concludes our program, but I really, really thank everyone again for their support, and thanks for sticking with us to the end and listening to this somewhat of a tough topic, but some of these issues are difficult, and we have to know the truth so that we can change what's happening for animals.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt and Abby, for spending time with us today. And thank you to all of you for joining us and having such a great conversation. You will be able to view a recording of this webinar along with other past webinars on our website at aldf.org/webinars. If we didn't get to your question, you can send it into events@aldf.org, but you can also reach out to our speakers directly, and both of their emails are still up on the presentation. We encourage you to please take the survey that will pop up on your screen to help us in future planning. You might need to click a blue button that says continue to access it. And this is our final webinar of 2022. So have a wonderful holiday season, and please know how much that we all appreciate your ongoing support of the animals. Have a great day, everyone.